This is my 60-second video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 36th, dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part deals with my attempts to improve the layout by adding trees and other vegetation and fences, walls and hedges. I'd been commenting that I needed to do this for some time, but rather putting it off, as it's not the sort of thing I'm much good at, and also since it involves a lot of awkward leaning over the board whilst drilling and manipulating, etc., and I have a bad back and other health problems, much of the process tends to be rather difficult and unpleasant for me. I started with some fencing. I'd managed to pick up a number of packs of OO gauge fencing, 3 packs of ratio fencing in dark brown, white and off-white. I would have rather got the same colour, but this was all I could find, and 1 pack of Pico Fencing in brown. I'd used some ratio flexible fencing on my N gauge layout and liked that. It was made of a plastic that was very flexible, pretty much impossible to break, and it featured posts that were extended downwards so that I could fix the fencing in place simply by pushing those posts into the foam surface of my N gauge board, which worked very well. This ratio OO gauge fencing, however, was not similar. I'd hoped it would be, but it wasn't. It was made of much harder plastic, which broke quite easily, although the dark brown pack, which was probably newer stock, was not as brittle as the other 2 packs. And also, this ratio fencing didn't feature extended posts, so I don't quite know how you were expected to fix it onto your layout other than by simply gluing it onto the surface, which isn't the most satisfactory arrangement. The Pico fencing was quite different. It required quite a bit of assembly, whereas the ratio fencing just needed to be cut from the sprues. Here's how the Pico fencing came once unpacked. It did feature extended posts to be embedded into the board. The ratio fencing came just as straight sections with no extended posts and fairly little flexibility. When I tried to bend the ratio fencing around curves in my track, it mostly just snapped. I was able to get one section bent around a fairly gentle curve in my road. I fixed the ratio fencing in place by attaching the bottom of the posts to the board with CA superglue, as I couldn't really see how else to do it. And it wasn't that easy to hold it in place like this, especially on a curve. With the Pico fencing, the first thing required was to attach these little short posts onto the fence rails by pushing the little pins into the little holes. This was not easy. Here's one of the 5 sections that came in the pack with its 3 short posts in place. The sections can then be joined together by pushing the pins on the ends of the rails of one section into the holes in the end post of another section. Alternatively, separate end posts are provided on the sprues for use if you just want to end the section without attaching it to another section. Here are 2 sections joined together. I found the best way to do this was to squeeze the ends of the rails into the recesses in the post with pliers and then push the pins firmly home with the tip of a pair of tweezers. For the short posts, I eventually concluded that the best method was to push the top pin into the top hole without worrying about the rest. Once that top pin was in place, the post could be pivoted to line up with the other pins and they could be pushed home. Not easy though, as the pins are quite soft and don't push into the holes readily. Here are the 5 sections that came in the pack assembled. It took me the best part of an hour to get this assembly done. Then I joined all of the sections together as I intended to use this as continuous line-side fencing. Here's one of the joins between the sections again. One thing that can be said for this fencing is that once the pins are firmly pushed home, the fencing stays together without requiring any glue for assembly. In order to put this fencing in place beside my track, I had to use a large cordless drill to make holes in my board, as my board is made of MDF, which is hard stuff and does not cut or drill easily. With a foam board, this would have been much easier. Drilling the holes made a lot of sawdust. Also, it was hard to get the holes placed exactly, so the fencing ended up rather wiggly. I cleaned up the sawdust from the drilling using my mains-operated Shark vacuum cleaner. I wasn't very happy with the result, although I certainly prefer the Pico Fencing over the ratio that I had. I had a variety of things that I'd obtained in the ways of vegetation. Here are a couple of nice Woodland Classics trees and some Scene Master hedging. I'd previously placed several of these little trees round the layout. They came with cardboard bases. Now I removed the cardboard bases and fixed the trees into the board with piano wire. Here I'm just trying out the placing of the large Woodland Classic trees. They're not fixed at the moment, I'm just standing them in place. Here you can see two more of those trees with cardboard bases. And here I've got rid of the bases and fixed the trees into the board. Here's another one of those over by one of the hoardings from the Wills set. I drilled into the bottoms of the trees and inserted short pieces of thin piano wire. Then I'd drill an appropriately sized hole in the board and insert the wire into that hole. Rather a performance, but pretty much the only way of firmly fixing the trees onto the MDF board. Here's that tree back in place. I'll put some bits of vegetation round the base later to make it look more natural. The large Woodland Classics trees could be detached from their bases, and then they had large pegs on the bottom. So I was able to fix them into the board by drilling holes large enough for those pegs, although this made sawdust that needed to be vacuumed up first, since quite a large hole was required. Here's the other large tree similarly inserted. Here's the view from the side. I tried to place the trees so that they looked reasonably natural and interesting, but didn't hide too much of all the buildings I put so much effort into building. I had a whole bunch more small trees. These I bought off eBay. And here are some more trees that I bought used from tiny railroads in Delhi, Ontario, and some adhesive clumps of vegetation, which I find very handy, especially around the roots of trees or by fences or walls. I also had various clump vegetation and coarse turf. This is resin stone walling, of which I bought a quantity when building my Bachmann EZ gauge layout. I plan to use this to divide the properties on my Hornby layout. I added coarse turf and clump vegetation on my foam hills and sprayed alcohol and then diluted white glue in an attempt to fix the vegetation. Here's the back hill next to the engine shed, done the same way. The glue shouldn't be visible once it dries overnight. I took this picture of the central area of the layout in order to help me plan the divisions between the different properties. Using a graphics program on my PC, I sketched in where I wanted to put walls and hedges. The grey lines represent intended stone walls, and the green lines intended hedges. I tried to take into account the various doors of the buildings. I was also still mucking around trying to use different colours of coarse turf to create some variation in the grass surfaces. I don't know entirely how well this worked, but it definitely wasn't worse than just the plain static grass. Here's the front left hill after the glue dried. I started to fit my wall sections. This was a bit tricky as the resin walling only comes in standard lengths and doesn't have any built-in flexibility. In order to get walls to fit my plan, I had to cut the resin sections, which I initially did with a razor saw, although I eventually concluded that a cutting disc on a rotary tool did a better job. It wasn't easy to cut the resin with the razor saw. The saw tended to stick in the cut, and then eventually the resin broke. Still, I made some progress in fitting my required sections. Once I had got the pieces for a section of wall ready, I glued them together on a piece of foam board on the bench using CA glue. This was fairly tricky to do. The resin sections don't fit very precisely together. It's more of a vague connection with a lot of gaps, so large quantities of CA needed to be used to fill the gaps, and even using accelerant, those large amounts of CA took a while to set, and the wall needed to be held straight and level until the CA set. I made up the wall round the back of the hotel in 2 sections. The wall from the left to just short of the top right corner is glued together here, but the rest is not yet glued. Here are the pieces for the rest of that wall ready for gluing together. You can't really make a seamless hole from these resin pieces. You can see a typical join on the left here. Here's the whole of that section glued together. You can certainly see the joins if you look for them, but I don't think they'll be very noticeable on the layout. Here's that section in place beside the hotel. And here I've got all of my intended walls in place. Now I wanted to use a hedge round the garden of the cottage. I started by gluing the back section of the hedge across from the wall behind the hotel to the wall from the school. I let the glue on the first section dry and then glued the next section beside the bell inn up to the road. I used Woodland Scenic's foam tack glue as I had quite a bit of it left after using it for my road bed, and it seemed to be essentially a fast-drying type of white glue. For the hedge on the road side of the cottage, I wanted to leave a gap in front of the entry porch, so I put a piece of masking tape onto the road and marked where the gap in the hedge needed to be. Then I temporarily removed the cottage building and glued the hedge round to the side of the gap, cutting off the excess with scissors. Next I glued the hedge up from the hotel wall to the road. I put Vegetation onto the hill by the hedge shunt and sprayed it with alcohol and glue, using a piece of cardboard to protect the wall and the back scene. I used scrap pieces of pink foam to clean off any glue that got onto the tracks. I did the hill in the back corner the same way, using some newspaper in addition to the cardboard for masking. Once the glue on the first bit dried, I took the hedge round to the other side of the gap for the entry and cut it off appropriately. The layout was looking quite a mess at this point, with materials all over it, and I was struggling a bit with some of this stuff as all of the bending over the board was hard for me. I put a bunch of small trees onto the front left hill. Since this hill is made from white foam under the static grass, it was quite easy to push the trees into place, although I did find it necessary to use pliers to push the bases of the trees into the foam, as the small plastic trees were too bendy to just push in from the top. I put a few trees onto the hill by the engine shed, and a bunch of trees onto the hill by the hedge shunt. I'd be the first to admit that this kind of landscaping is definitely not my forte. I put a few more trees in around the cottage and used vegetation tufts to blend in the bases of the trees and along some of the walls. I'm not entirely sure how natural this looks, but it does hide the place where the tree is inserted into the board, helping to make it look less plastic. Here's the area behind the cottage done that way. And here's the area between the engine shed and the signal box. I'm constantly annoyed by what a bad job I made of sticking up the back scene. Here's a view of the goods shed and the hotel area. Still not all that realistic, I guess, but I don't know that I'm going to be able to do much more with it. Here's a view pretty much of all of this small layout after all this effort. When I tried to run trains after all this, predictably I had some problems. It turned out that the line-side fencing at this end was too close to the track, and trains were actually hitting the fence posts and derailing or getting stuck. I couldn't really have put the fencing much further back with the hills the way I had them. I guess I should have allowed more clearance for the track right from the start when building the layout. As it was, basically, I just did my best to bend the fencing back until there was enough clearance for trains to pass. I'll try that for now. If it continues to cause problems, I may have to remove this fencing.